The skies over Europe were a graveyard. In 1943, American bombers roared toward Germany every morning, silver fortresses glinting against the clouds, but few returned. The Luftwaffe owned the air. Fighter after fighter tore into the B-17s and B-24s like wolves hunting through a herd. Crews called it the aluminum rain, and somewhere over the smoking fields of France, the hope of air supremacy was dying one raid at a time. They called it the Big Week. The Americans had promised that massed formations could cripple Germany's factories, break its fuel lines, and end the war faster. But the reality was blood and fire. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore through the bomber streams, cannons blazing, shredding wings and engines, before the crews even reached their targets. Every mission deeper into the Reich meant higher losses. 80 bombers out of 100 might make it home, some days fewer. The Germans had turned the sky into a fortress of their own, one the Allies couldn't seem to breach. At the bases in England, the air smelled of oil and frost. Mechanics worked in silence beneath tarps, patching bullet holes, replacing engines, cleaning out blood. And among the rows of aircraft sat one that few bothered to look at, a sleek, narrow fighter with a shark-like nose and long wings that seemed too delicate for war. The name painted on its side read Mustang. The Germans had seen it before, and they weren't impressed. A few Allied squadrons had flown it in low-altitude missions. It was fast, yes, but weak. Above 15,000 feet, the engine gasped. Against a Bf-109 or a Focke-Wulf 190, it was no contest. Luftwaffe pilots laughed at it. They called it der englische Esel, the English donkey, a plane that could run but couldn't climb. A nuisance, not a threat. In truth, they weren't wrong. The early Mustangs were born of compromise, a British request, an American experiment, and an engine not built for the heights of European war, the Allison 5. 1710 struggled to breathe in thin air, its power fading where the Germans thrived. Even Allied pilots joked about it. Pretty lines, poor heart. It could strafe trains, chase trucks, but not protect the bombers dying over Bremen and Schweinfurt. But somewhere deep inside that machine, there was potential, something waiting to wake up. A handful of engineers in Britain saw it. They believed that the Mustang's body was perfect. Its laminar flow wings reduced drag, its aerodynamics years ahead of its time. The problem wasn't the plane, it was the soul inside it. So in the summer of 1942, they made a decision that would change the air war forever. They took out the Allison, and they replaced it with a monster, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. When the first modified Mustang roared to life, the ground trembled. Its tone was deeper, harsher, alive. On the test flight, it climbed past 20,000 feet with ease. Faster than any Spitfire, steadier than a Lightning. The engineers stared at their instruments, then at each other. The laughter stopped. Back in Germany, the Luftwaffe was still celebrating its dominance. In briefing rooms across occupied Europe, commanders reviewed reports of American raids with confidence. The enemy's bombers were slow, predictable, exposed. Their fighters couldn't follow them far enough to matter. General Adolf Galland, the pride of the Luftwaffe, said it plainly. The Americans will never defeat us in the air. They cannot reach us. But something was coming. In a hangar in England, under dim lights and freezing air, crews painted new numbers on the side of the experimental fighter. They had no idea they were looking at the future, the plane that would one day escort bombers all the way to Berlin, tear the Luftwaffe apart, and make Germany's proudest pilots look up at a sky they no longer controlled. For now, the Mustang sat silent, its skin still dull, its engine still cooling from tests. But soon it would climb into the clouds, and when it did, every flight over Europe would change forever. And on that day, the same men who laughed at it would start whispering another name for it. Not donkey, but death. The first mission began before dawn. A thin frost coated the airfield, the kind that made the fuel lines stiff and the breath of every man visible in the pale light. Mechanics whispered final checks. Pilots stood beside their aircraft, gloves clenched, eyes fixed on the horizon. Among them stood a young American major named Don Gentile. He had flown P-47 Thunderbolts before, big, heavy, powerful machines, but this one felt different, sleeker, hungrier. The new P-51 Mustang, now powered by the British Merlin engine, had arrived quietly at bases across England, and no one yet knew just how fast it could change the war. The orders were simple: escort the bombers, protect them if attacked, and, if fuel allowed, strike targets of opportunity. But the truth was, this was a test. The 8th Air Force wanted to see if the new engine and design could survive where no Allied fighter had before, deep inside German airspace. The engines roared to life in unison. A wave of sound rolled across the airfield. Then, one by one, the Mustangs lifted off into the mist, silver streaks slicing through the fog, climbing higher, faster, stronger than anyone had seen before. At 25,000 feet, they formed up with the bombers, hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses glinting in the morning sun. Their course, Bremen. It was a mission the Germans knew well, and they were waiting. Somewhere over the North Sea, radar stations on the coast picked up the incoming formation. The alarm spread like fire. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled to their aircraft. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek, deadly predators that had owned this sky for years. They laughed when they saw the new escorts. Some even radioed to their controllers, American toys. But when they dove in to attack, the laughter stopped. The Mustangs didn't turn away. They climbed to meet them. The Merlin engines screamed at full throttle, and the air around them shimmered with condensation trails. Gentile rolled his Mustang inverted, dove through a line of bombers, and came out behind a 109 that had been closing in. His finger squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber Brownings spat fire. The German fighter erupted into flame. That was the first kill. Dozens followed. German formations broke apart, confusion spreading over the radios. Their old tactics, diving attacks, hit-and-run passes, weren't working anymore. The Mustangs could follow them, chase them, and finish them. By the time the bombers reached their targets, the air belonged to the Americans. When the Mustangs landed back at Debden hours later, their wings were streaked with soot, their ammunition belts empty. Gentile climbed out of his cockpit and just smiled. "She climbs like an angel," he said. Within weeks, word spread across every Allied base: the Mustang works. More squadrons were converted. Pilots who had doubted the plane now begged to fly it. The aircraft that once sat in the corner of hangars now became the pride of every airfield in England. And across the Channel, the Germans began to realize that something had changed. Reports came in from every command sector. Unidentified high-speed fighters spotted over Münster, escorts seen near Hanover, Mustangs chasing 190s back to their own runways. The Reich's once invincible air shield was cracking. Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's chief of fighters, studied the reports with disbelief. He ordered his pilots to identify the new plane. When the photographs came in, he stared in silence. Long nose, wide canopy, streamlined wings. The same Mustang they had mocked a year earlier, now carrying death into the heart of Germany. By December 1943, bomber losses dropped dramatically. And by the spring of 1944, the change was absolute. The Mustang wasn't just escorting bombers, it was hunting the Luftwaffe itself. But success came with a cost. Every new mission pushed deeper into enemy territory. Every engagement tested the men and the machines to their limits. For every victory, another pilot failed to return. In the ready rooms, chairs sat empty. Helmets rested on desks that would never be used again. War, even when you were winning, didn't forgive. Yet the crews knew what they were doing mattered. They weren't just flying another mission, they were taking back the sky, inch by inch, cloud by cloud. And somewhere in Berlin, a voice on the German radio finally said what every pilot already knew. The Americans have a new fighter, and it owns the day. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. The laughter was gone, and soon it wouldn't just be protecting bombers, it would be leading them. The morning of March 4th, 1944, began like countless others, cold, gray, and silent. At air bases across England, thousands of men prepared for what they thought would be just another bombing raid into the heart of Germany. But this mission would mark a turning point, one that would echo through history. The target was Berlin. No American bomber had ever made it there and back in daylight. Until now, that had been suicide. Inside the briefing rooms, cigarette smoke hung thick. Over maps covered in red lines, commanders spoke quietly. They knew what was at stake. Reaching Berlin wasn't just about destroying factories or rail yards. It was about breaking the myth of German invincibility. And outside, waiting on the frosted runways, sat the reason it might finally be possible. The P-51 Mustang. Hundreds of them lined the field, wings gleaming under the pale morning light. The pilots climbed into their cockpits, their faces hard, their breath fogging in the cold air. Engines roared to life. The ground shook. The sound rolled across the countryside like thunder. The bombers took off first, great lumbering beasts, silver and slow. Then the Mustangs followed, climbing high, forming up above the B-17 as they crossed the channel. At 25,000 feet, the world turned white. Clouds below, blue sky above, contrails stretching for miles. Somewhere ahead lay Berlin. Inside the Luftwaffe command center, the alarm went up. Radar screens lit up like a storm. The operators shouted coordinates, scrambling every fighter they had. Over 300 German aircraft took off from airfields across northern Germany. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and even the first jet prototypes, all rising to meet the intruders. For months, the Luftwaffe had hunted bombers freely once the escorts turned back. But today, the Americans didn't turn back. At first, the German pilots thought it was a trick. When they spotted the bombers still 30 minutes from the capital, they waited for the familiar signal. The escorts breaking off to refuel, but the Mustangs stayed, and then they dove. The sky exploded into chaos. Silver wings against black crosses, tracers arced through the clouds. Parachutes bloomed and vanished in smoke. In the midst of it all, the Mustangs cut through the German formations like blades. Captain James Howard, flying with the 354th Fighter Group, found himself alone, one man against dozens of enemy aircraft attacking a bomber formation. For half an hour, he fought them off single-handedly. His guns jammed, his fuel ran low, but he stayed with the bombers. When he landed, the crews who had watched from above swore they'd seen a miracle. Howard was later awarded the Medal of Honor. By the time the bombers reached Berlin, the German defense was in ruins. Factories burned, airfields smoldered, and for the first time the German people saw daylight bombs falling over their capital. The unthinkable had happened. The Reich's sky, once untouchable, was now open. Back in England, as the returning aircraft touched down, the base erupted in cheers. The Mustangs had done what no fighter before them could. They had taken the bombers to Berlin and brought them home. General Jimmy Doolittle, now commander of the 8th Air Force, saw the opportunity and seized it. He changed the rules of war. The fighters were no longer to stick to the bombers. They were to go ahead, to hunt. Every Mustang became a predator. They strafed airfields, ambushed German fighters before takeoff, and shredded anything that moved on the ground. The results were devastating. In a single month, the Luftwaffe lost over a third of its trained pilots. By the summer of 1944, Germany's air defense system, once the pride of the Reich, was collapsing. German aces who had ruled the skies since 1940 now faced a new generation of Americans who could fight on equal terms and win. The balance had shifted. The hunter had become the hunted. Inside his headquarters, Adolf Galland read the casualty reports in silence. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply folded the paper, looked out the window, and said, "The day of the fighter pilot is over." Above him, the sound of engines rolled through the clouds. Not German, but American. They came in waves now, endless and unstoppable. The same pilots who had once watched helplessly as their friends were cut down were now masters of the air. They could see the fear in the eyes of their enemies, and with every mission the Reich burned a little brighter. The laughter that once greeted the Mustang had vanished completely. Now the Germans whispered another word when they saw it. Schrecken, terror. And yet for the men flying it there was no joy in the killing, just exhaustion, and the quiet understanding that every victory brought them one step closer to the end. But the end was still far away, because even as Germany burned, the Reich still had one final weapon waiting, faster, deadlier, and unlike anything the world had ever seen, and soon the Mustang would have to face it. By the fall of 1944, the sky above Germany had become a battlefield of ghosts. The Luftwaffe still fought, but its ranks were thin. Boys barely out of school flying machines they'd never been properly trained to use. Every day they launched into the cold gray air, and every day fewer returned. Yet even as the Reich crumbled, it had one last miracle left to unveil, one last hope to turn the tide. It was called the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It appeared like a streak of silver lightning, faster than anything in the sky, able to outrun, outclimb, and outdive every propeller-driven aircraft ever built. When American pilots first saw it, they could hardly believe it was real. In the split second it passed by, they barely had time to react before it vanished beyond reach. In its first few engagements, the Me-262 tore through bomber formations, scattering them like leaves. Its 30mm cannons shredded engines, wings, and crews with single bursts. For a moment, just a moment, the Germans believed salvation had arrived. But Curtis LeMay's bombers didn't stop coming, and the Mustangs didn't stop hunting. They adapted. The Me-262 was fast, yes, too fast for a dogfight, but it had a weakness. It was fragile during takeoff and landing. Its jet engines took long, precious seconds to spool up. At low speed, it was a sitting duck. So the Mustang pilots changed their game. They waited above German airfields, circling like hawks. When the jets came into land, the P-51s dove. Gunfire tore through the Me-262s before they could even touch down. Dozens of the precious jets were destroyed on the ground. Captain Chuck Yeager, a Mustang ace who would one day break the sound barrier, recalled those hunts. "The 262 was a marvel," he said, "but war doesn't wait for marvels. It waits for men who know how to use them." By December, the Me-262 had become a symbol not of hope, but of desperation. There were never enough of them, and never enough fuel to keep them flying. Even when they took off, the skies were already swarming with Mustangs. The Luftwaffe's last chance died on its own runways. Meanwhile, the Allies pressed deeper into Germany. Bombers no longer feared crossing the Rhine. They hit oil refineries, munitions depots, and the last remnants of the German rail system. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished beneath waves of flame. Everywhere the Mustangs went, the ground below changed color, blackened, scarred, burned. But even victory had its price. Many of the men flying those silver wings would never see home again. They had names painted on their planes: Old Crow, Big Beautiful Doll, Glamorous Glen. Each one carried stories of laughter, fear, and exhaustion. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Europe was no longer a contest. It was a reckoning. The Mustangs ruled from horizon to horizon. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was a memory, a collection of burned wrecks on abandoned runways. When Allied ground forces crossed into Germany, they found airfields littered with the remains of what had been the most advanced air force in the world. Broken Mi-62s, half-finished prototypes, shattered cockpits. Above them, the last American patrols flew in silence. No enemy, no gunfire, just the wind. For the pilots, it was hard to understand what they'd achieved. They had started the war as underdogs, outnumbered, outgunned, and underestimated, and now they were the ones who owned the sky. The Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had broken an empire. And with every mission, it carried the war closer to its end. But for some of those men, Europe wasn't the end. A new front was calling, half a world away, over the endless Pacific. A different war, but the same fight for control of the air. The Mustang would go there too. And even as Germany burned, new orders were already being written. New ships were loading crates marked P-51D. The plane that had silenced the laughter over Berlin would soon rise again, over the islands of Japan. The war in Europe was ending, but the war itself was not. Across the Pacific, Japan still fought on, defiant and unbroken. Cities burned, yet the rising sun still flew above the ruins. From the charred airfields of England to the humid islands of the Marianas, a new order was given. The P-51 Mustang was to follow the war to its final battleground. On the tarmac of Iwo Jima, the air shimmered with heat. Mechanics worked bare-chested under the Pacific sun, bolting long-range fuel tanks beneath the Mustang's wings. The old markings of Europe were replaced with new ones. Bright red propeller spinners, black identification stripes. The pilots knew what this meant. The B-29 Superfortress, America's new giant, needed escorts, just as the B-17s once had. The distance from Iwo Jima to Japan was 700 miles. No other fighter could make that journey and fight, but the Mustang could. They called these missions very long range. 8-hour flights across open ocean, every minute a risk. Engine failure meant death. Fuel miscalculation meant vanishing into the blue. And yet they went. When they reached the Japanese coast, they found a different war. The skies were thick with smoke from burned cities, but the defense still fought with the same ferocity that had shocked the world in 1941. Ki-84s and Zeros rose to meet them, agile, fast, and flown by men who would rather die than yield. The Mustangs didn't flinch. They weaved through tracer fire, tore through the interceptors, and stayed with the bombers all the way to Tokyo. It was the same story told on another continent. At first, they were underestimated. Then they were feared. As the months passed, Japan's skies changed. The raids grew larger, deadlier. Entire districts vanished in firestorms that turned night into day. The Mustang pilots saw it all. The glow of burning cities reflected off the ocean hundreds of miles away. Some of them cheered, believing every mission brought peace closer. Others stayed quiet, knowing what those fires meant. By the summer of 1945, the world was burning on both sides of the horizon. And then the bomb fell. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The war that began in laughter and arrogance ended in silence and ash. When the surrender came, the Mustangs flew one last mission, not to fight, but to escort the final wave of B-29s over a nation that could no longer rise to meet them. Below, Japan lay still. No tracers, no sirens, no resistance. They flew home in formation, wings gleaming in the sunlight, the engines steady and low. And for the first time, the men in those cockpits didn't feel victory. They felt exhaustion. The P-51 Mustang had outlasted them all. It had flown over 2 wars, crossed 2 oceans, and rewritten the very idea of air power. Born from doubt, baptized by fire, it had become a legend that would define the sky for generations. When the last Mustang shut down its engine on the runway at Iwo Jima, the silence was absolute. No laughter, no cheers, just the slow ticking of cooling metal and the hum of the wind across the wings. For the men who had flown it, that sound was everything. The sound of survival.
The Germans once laughed at the P-51 Mustang.
They laughed until the sky itself turned against them, until daylight brought thunder and their cities rained fire. And when the smoke cleared, all that remained was the echo of those engines, the song of the machine that turned mockery into fear and fear into the end of a war. The Mustang didn't just win the air, it owned it. And above the ruins of two empires, it flew on, quiet, eternal, undefeated.